Google Chrome gives all google.com sites full access to system and tab CPU usage, GPU usage, and memory usage. It also gives access to detailed processor information, and it provides a logging back channel. This API is not exposed to other sites, only to google.com sites. Oh boy, this is going to be a fun one. I'll be honest, I didn't know Google was exposing these many things like on a native Chrome level. Call me whatever you want. I know. I am an investor in Google. I'm a little defensive of Google, but I also hate them, make fun of them all the time. I think Android's a tragedy more than it is an operating system. So call me whichever bias you want to make yourself feel better. I think this is sketchy, and I think we should talk about it. So what's going on here? Let's finish reading the thread, and then we can play a bit to see what's being talked about. This is interesting because it's a clear violation of the idea that browser vendors should not give preference to their websites over anyone else's. I totally agree. And I think there have been a lot of cases where Google's gotten unfair shit for this. A big one is YouTube. I've seen a lot of coverage that Google's trying to intentionally slow down Firefox on YouTube so people have to move. As someone who builds a video platform themselves, if you're not already familiar, ping.gg, I've put a lot of work into trying to get AV stuff to behave at all inside of Firefox. And it doesn't, because Firefox's AV layer is a pile of duct tape and promises. It sucks. And the fact that Google's using things like HLS properly, and then Firefox doesn't know how to parse the packets if they're not perfectly sequential, is a failure in Firefox, not an attempt by Google to make people not use Firefox. So yeah, most of the time these complaints happen, I think they're bullshit. This one is very legitimate, and that's why I want to take the time to dig into it. I will say the DMA point here is more scary than it is exciting to me, because the DMA has proven to be a weird piece of legislation with some really weird edge cases that aren't great, while also not doing the things we wanted it to do. Don't get me started on the current state of Apple and the DMA, because we got none of what we wanted out of it, and we got a lot of additional pain. So yeah, good chat already. FF is now F. Yeah. Depending on how you interpret the Digital Markets Act, this additional exposure of information only to Google properties may be considered a violation of the DMA. Take, for example, Zoom. They're now at a disadvantage because they cannot provide the same CPU debugging feature as Google Meet. To be fair, Zoom does not want you using Zoom in the browser. As someone who refuses to install Zoom due to the backdoor they did way back, you guys don't remember, Zoom used to have a really fun security issue. They might even still have it. Does Zoom keep a backdoor even after uninstalling it from your PC? This was a big deal. Zoom was caught leaving behind a server after uninstalling that became a huge attack vector once an exploit was discovered. Any site could turn on your webcam. Terrifying. So yeah, Zoom might not be the best example, because Zoom both pushes you really hard to install native shit and has massive security issues. So yeah, personally would have used Ping as an example, but I get it. This would actually be really helpful for us with Ping to actually know how much CPU is available, and not our logs would be so much more useful. Oh, I would kill for this info, but I understand why we don't have it. What I don't understand is why Google does. For those interested, this is done through a built-in Chrome extension that cannot be disabled, and it does not show up in the extensions panel. The source code is here. It's unclear whether the same extension also ships in other Chromium-derived browsers. Apparently, in Edge, this also is a thing, which is hilarious. Even Brave got hit. Brave also has the same behavior as Chrome and Edge. The extension that allows Google to retrieve this information exclusively from start.google.com is also pre-installed in Brave. Apparently, this is necessary for things like Google Meet to work. No, Google Meet-like services is only Google Meet. Zoom, for example, does work. Yeah. Brandon Ike hopped in to defend the Brave situation. There are many such self-dealing bits. They seem to be a violation of the EUDMA and the open source. Again, see the deviations from Chromium Living Doc, where we maintain the Brave browser's repo wiki. Yeah, the Hangouts extension is enabled by default on desktop to make sure Google Hangouts works as expected on Brave. We disable log uploading to Google services. You can turn it off by toggling the switch. Interesting. So this is all just for Google Meet, by the looks of it. Very, very interesting. Let me do a quick read through of this source. This always comes down to WebRTC every single time. Right now, I'm feeling particularly gaslit because I spent a lot of time trying to get really good performance out of our video call app. If you're not familiar, again, we built a video call app in the browser, very similar to Google Meet. In fact, Google Meet's our biggest inspiration by a lot. And there was a lot of performance and behavior characteristics I couldn't quite replicate. And it makes sense that they had access to things I didn't have access to. And this Hangout service seems to be key. The fact that there is this extension built into Chrome that is part of the Chromium source and is often copied by other browsers. As our friend Brandon Ike just said, the Hangouts extension is by default enabled inside of Brave, which is based on Chromium, because they want to make sure Google Meet works properly in their browser. And without it, Google Meet and Hangouts and all of the similar things, I know Google Meet's changed names 15 times, it makes this even more confusing, but this is based entirely around Google Meet by the looks of it. I would be surprised if this code was being accessed on other Google properties, but I would like to test that. And I might actually take the time to try and brute force that test in the near future. But if we look at the manifests, you can see the permissions that Google domains are getting. They're getting desktop capture, enterprise hardware platform, processes, system CPU, and then WebRTC stuff. Because this is largely meant for WebRTC, and obviously desktop capture is so you can screen share inside. I'm guessing the enterprise hardware platform and the system.cpu permissions are the ones that most things don't have access to. Everything else here is like Chrome specific bullshit. I don't want to do yet another video breaking down the chaos of Chrome extensions. So just trust me that when I read this, it reads like a pretty typical manifest for something that is trying to access Google Meets. The other thing to note is the openness of this domain matcher. This seems like they clearly want this to work on all Google domains. But Google's biggest domains aren't google.com. Gmail is, sure, but YouTube isn't. So this would never run on YouTube. If I was trying to use YouTube's browser live streaming stuff, this wouldn't work. But if Google's changing the name of Meet every few years, where it used to be hangouts.google.com, now it's meet.google.com, maybe there are some businesses that have their own subdomain that's whitelisted that is just Google Meet still, and they need this to work for them too. That's my gut feel here, why this is so open. I'm getting a little bit less concerned. It's still not good. It's still potentially a violation, but it would have been really nice if in the original tweet, it was specified that the intent seems to be just for Google Hangouts and Meet. And I'm already seeing the comments like, wow, Theo's that biased. He invests some money in Google and now he's going to defend them doing anything. I just want to understand. Let's read the code to better understand. Method is cpu.getInfo. We get it. If the method's logging.set metadata, we set it. Logging start. If you ever wondered if doing a bunch of if-else statements to process a message was okay, or if you should just use a switch, here you go. They did not use a switch for this. They went ham on the giant if-else. So if Google thinks it's good enough, you probably should too. This is actually a little bit sketchy. In order to make sure that they have desktop media and they have access to the things they want to have access to, the tab has to think it is the right domain. Because this is so specific to Google domains, they actually manually update the tab's URL to be the Google URL, even though it's not going to load the page or do anything. This is just to brute force access through an iframe. So yeah, this does work through iframes, and the way it does is kind of weird and sketchy. Plum, system audio, and other things here. I love that there's a to-do in 11-year-old code. It's great. Called after the user selected a desktop media source, so it does not need to be conditional. Cool. And on-process CPU. Here's where people are getting skeeved out, and honestly fair, you can get way too much identifying info from having access to someone's processor. Continuously reporting relevant CPU usage information to the page. So why would they need CPU utilization at all for anything, especially Google Meet? Well, taking video from a webcam and then compressing that into a format that's small enough to send through a video streaming service, that's not cheap. That's not something that you can just do on a crappy Raspberry Pi easily. You kind of can, but then once you're loading and decoding other people's videos at the same time in parallel, it starts to fall apart. So knowing how much processor you have available and can use is really important so that you know what quality you should be encoding at. Because encoding a 1080p video takes way more CPU than encoding a 360p 15 to 10 FPS video. And a lot of the time we see people having performance issues in ping where the video quality isn't good. They always assume it's bandwidth, and almost every single time it ends up being a CPU issue, not a bandwidth issue, which might be unintuitive to people who haven't spent a lot of time in video, but the amount of power it takes to encode video live is great enough that it would be really useful for us to have this information. And I see why Google hacked it in, because Google Meet wanted to put a good service in the browser. But this is honestly kind of emphasizing to me how hard it is to make a good video call app in the browser, because the only reason Google's could be this good is they hacked Chrome to let themselves get info that otherwise you wouldn't have access to. So here we have the browser process and the GPU process, because again, graphics acceleration is very helpful for doing these encodings, and that's what this is all here for. So the post message browser CPU usage, it says how much process we're using, how much GPU we're using, how much CPU for the tab we're using, how much memory is allocated, and how much memory is actually being used. These two we have access to already. So these are things you can get in Chrome right now on any website. But these processor related ones, and specifically having access to how much GPU is being used, that's sketch. Chrome.processes unupdated listener. Okay, so this is just a check for when you connect an external device to allow you to select it. So this would be like I plug in a new webcam and a thing pops up that says, hey, do you want to use that new webcam? So none of the code here is actually super sketchy. It's possible these things are being used in sketchy ways on Google sites because they have this event listener that you could send things to and then get data back. Like I could ask it for CPU info and it will spit out Chrome system CPU get info. That might be sketchy. Is this a thing we can just call? So like if I go to google.com and I open up my console here, that a thing I can just call? No. Chrome.system is undefined. That much makes sense. But how could I easily fake this? I'm trying to decide how hard I want to go trying to test this. It's also possible this only works in Chrome. Back in Chrome, Chrome.system. What do I have on Chrome? Almost nothing. Oh boy, is low level in here? We hacking? Yeah, I might actually take the time to like localhost abuse to brute force me to have access to fake Google domains. The Chrome API is accessed more than 200,000 times every time a Google search happens. Interesting. Very interesting. I kind of want to abuse that. What happens if I just reassign Chrome stuff? Test search. Trying to decide how I want to exploit this and how hard I want to go trying to exploit it. Check the tweet linked above. Ooh boy. Paste this into Chrome DevTools. Thank you, Simon, for the quick exploit. So this identifier, that's for the Chrome extension that is baked in, by the way. So if we were to go to manifest, I'm guessing no. Interesting. It must be embedded in like the ID gets assigned during the embedding process. So that ID is coming from other places. But this is the ID for that specific code. And that references the code here. So if we go in here, we can see the other messages we can send. So we could send get hardware platform info. Will that work? Not allowed. Interesting. We can start event logging at least, probably. Feature disabled. Interesting. So it seems like some of these features are not enabled. But if I go to meet.google.com, will they be enabled here? Nope. Cool. So a handful of the things in here can't really be abused by Google. It seems like the get hardware platform info and the event loggers are actually disabled in standard Chrome. If I seem a little more tired, it's because I just spent like almost an hour deep diving on all of this to figure out how bad things actually are. I'll quickly TLDR with it's not as bad as it might have seemed initially. This is absolutely scoped to just be a thing for Google Meet. I can showcase what data they're getting and how bad it could be quick though. So the first thing I want to showcase is I'm using the snippet that Simon tweeted. We're going to go to Google. We're going to open up our console. And now we're going to paste the snippet, which sends to the Chrome runtime a message. Specifically, it sends it to this Chrome extension with this particular method. And then we console log the result. And here we have access to a bunch of info about my computer. We know it's ARM64. We know it's running an M2 Max. We know I have 12 processor cores available. And then we can see how much usage each of these cores has right now, as well as theoretically temperatures, but it does not seem like they're actually getting that data. So if I was to go look at the actual source code from this baked-in extension, which by the way, it's all open source, you can just go look at it. So here is the actual, what they call the Hangout service, because again, this is only integrated for Google Meet, which used to be called Hangouts. And my gut feel about the domain being more open like this, where it's using a star.google, is probably because Google Meet's domain has changed 4 or 5 times. We had Hangouts, we had Duo, we had Allo, we had Meet, we had this all in Gmail for a little bit. So I think they went with this more open URL pattern because Google Meet's URL kept fucking changing and they got tired of it. Just a guess, but it doesn't seem like other sites are accessing the scary parts here with specifically system CPU. Because these other parts like enterprise hardware platform, if we look at the code actually using that, it's this get hardware platform info. So it's like, you know what? That sounds useful. Let's try using that the same way. So we're going to go back and run the same command, if only these things worked. But I'm going to change cpu.getInfo to be a get hardware platform info. And immediately, error not allowed. I have no idea what Chrome Enterprise version is. I'm guessing it's a special locked down version of Chrome that they give to businesses that are really deep in like the Google Workspace ecosystem. It might even just be the version of Chrome that gets embedded on those little set-top boxes that you put in a room to do Google Meet. So this is not something you have to worry about being accessed or Google having controls that you don't have access to, because this one can't be called in your browser. I tried it in Arc, I tried it in Chrome, and get hardware platform info, as well as the logging.start event logging. These calls just don't work for us because the browsers that we have don't have them enabled. So we get feature disabled for that one and we get not allowed for this one. So you're probably good to go. Apparently, according to chat, Chrome OS is only on Google devices, things like the school Chromebooks that want to make sure students have restricted access to certain things. This API is only available to extensions installed by enterprise policy. Yeah, so this is not something you would really have to worry about. This is part of Google's like enterprise program that they sell to people to have control of their whole everything at their business to make sure that their employees or their students have the environment that they're supposed to have and don't have risk of things leaking. It is my understanding that any Chrome extension should theoretically have access to the system CPU calls. I wanted to be absolutely sure that these things weren't being called on other sites. And Mr. Josh here actually did a great deep dive. And he made a TaperMonkey script that he linked here to track Chrome. It's a Chrome tracker. And this script can be dumped using TamperMonkey. I'll always call it TaperMonkey, but wanted to give you guys the correct pronunciation just this one time. The value here is that we can see everything that is theoretically being done here. So if I go to Google Meet, you'll see that my proxy is now being registered. They also tell you to not just paste things in here. Sorry, Google. So here we have this initial value for when it's setting up the proxy. But from this point, every time something hits window.chrome, we're going to see what it's hitting it with. So if I start a new meeting, you'll see in here all of the things being accessed, including cpu.getInfo, because again, when you're making live video stuff, when you're encoding video, it's a complex process that uses a lot of CPU. So knowing that you're not using too much CPU makes it easy to know if you're going at too high a resolution, because encoding at 1080p might be fine bandwidth-wise, but if you don't have enough CPU to do that, you might be screwed. And that's a lot of what is happening here. Google is trying to solve the admittedly difficult problem here of making sure there's enough CPU usage when you're trying to do things with video. Or in this case, GPU as well, because I saw that they had some GPU stuff here. Yeah, they have a GPU process ID. Not every computer has a dedicated GPU, and not every computer has one that can be used for video encoding. So the code here is all written so they can see how much utilization is happening on your computer, so they can know whether or not you can be recording and encoding in high quality video or not. So yeah, if I had this for ping, it would have made our lives a lot easier, because most of the issues we've seen people having on ping are because their CPU is limiting them, not their bandwidth. So it's a common misconception that people don't stream 1080p because they don't have enough bandwidth, when often it's their CPU isn't able to encode video quickly enough. So that's why this is here. I can clearly see Google's intent here to make sure they are using the platform properly and to make sure that they're not asking for more than your computer is capable of delivering. There was more interesting details that Josh found here, though. Like on certain sites, like Google and YouTube, they were getting insane numbers of logs, but also Twitch was too. Why would Twitch and YouTube be getting like 200,000 plus console logs with this change? Well, it's important to note what this tracker is tracking. This tracker is tracking all calls to window.chrome because it wrapped it with this proxy. So it will still call the original message, but we'll get to see what it called first. Why? Well, this is the best way to know what these sites are calling. Well, then why are Twitch and YouTube calling window.chrome so much? Great question. If we take a quick look at what's actually being called, you'll see it's a lot of random shit, like request session, leave session, like MP4, all of these things. Most of this is a combination of Google using Chrome APIs to pass messages around for context, but also to know what types of media your device can and can't play. A lot of the window API stuff, if I go back here and just type window.chrome, you'll see in here, especially for casting, there's a ton of info here. So if you're trying to do things with media, like casting media or seeing what types of media your device is capable of using, The Chrome APIs are one of the best ways to access that information. So both YouTube and Twitch are calling this a lot because it's how they function. So it's not too big of a deal. So calling window.chrome by itself, unlikely to be sketchy. The concern people had was this access to chrome.system.cpu. This is sketch. This is scary that Google can theoretically just call for your CPU info whenever. But as I showed earlier, that info isn't particularly scary. If I just go back one more, they know how much of each of my cores is being used, and they know that I'm on an M2 Max and that it's ARM64. But that's not that sketchy. That's not that bad. It would be nice if other sites had access. Like if I go to Twitch and I run that same command, we won't have access, which is kind of annoying, admittedly, but that's not that big of a deal. It's kind of annoying that there is info like this that is useful, and that Google's goal of making sure Hangouts works immediately right when you set it up is nice, and it's absolutely a device identifier. But it's not quite as big of a deal as people seem to think, especially because that function is only called by Google when you're in Google Meet. If there was an instance of Google calling that function on other sites, we should be up in arms about that, especially if you're not signed in and they're using it to track your user identification info. That's huge. We're talking about a company that made the entire internet slower in order to keep people from being tracked. There was a case a while back, and when I say case, I mean a thing that happened, not a court case, where Google would share when you imported the same JavaScript from multiple sites. So if you use like the jQuery CDN URL, so if 3 different sites embed jQuery through their slim minified link. So if you go to multiple sites that have this JavaScript tag, you would think, oh, that's awesome. That means once one of them's loaded it, the other sites don't have to also load it. That is not the case, because if I put a script tag on 2 different sites that was unique to those 2 sites, I could see how long it takes to load to know if you've been to a site with this tag before or not. So as dumb as it might seem that you have to load the same JavaScript tag on every site you go to that has that tag, the benefit is you can't be tracked based on which JavaScript you load. So Google's actually quite willing to slow down Chrome and make it take up more space in order to protect you as a user from being tracked, which is a good thing. And this would have benefited Google too, and they chose not to do it and instead do the thing that protects you. So without evidence that Google is using this to identify users, which would be seeing these things happen when a user is signed out on other Google pages, it's hard for me to be that upset about the potential privacy violations that are going on here. Remember earlier when I said the more open domain was because Google keeps changing the URL for Meet? Here's the proof. In this diff, Google changed the extension to no longer be Hangouts Google, Talk Gadget Google, start at Talk Gadget Google, plus.google.com/hangouts. It changed it to just be all Google domains because the team managing this was tired of having to change it every time the Meet team changed their URL. Apparently, Google's been changing the domain and branding for Meet since all the way back in 2006. Yeah, Google Talk Beta. So this is just what Google does. Google changes the name of their products so often that it's easier for the engineers working on Chrome to just match all Google domains, even if these things aren't being used by those other domains. I wanted to confirm that anyone has access to these things if they were to make their own Chrome extension. And after spending far too much time reminding myself how Chrome extensions work and also making fun discoveries, like Google breaking JSON formatting rules by including comments which are not valid in JSON. But more importantly, that the enterprise permission that was in here, so I think it had enterprise or something like that, that broke this extension. But once I removed that, I could load the exact same JavaScript code, notably for all URLs. By the way, this can't be a star because that would follow norms too much. So Google made a special all URLs match here. But now that I have this and I've loaded it into Chrome, you see I have test Google perms here. It has a different ID of note. So I did the same thing we did before where we sent a message, but we sent it to my new extension instead, and we call the same cpu.getInfo, and it works. So theoretically, other Chrome extensions could be made that expose the same things, barring the enterprise side, but everything else that's exposed here absolutely could be exposed. Thankfully, you're probably not going to need to use some craziness like that to do this. If you want this information, there are other places to get it, because very soon we have the Pressure Observer web API coming. It won't get you the same level of detail. It won't tell you how many cores you have, what architecture your system's on, but it will tell you how much system resources are available and how much CPU pressure is being observed. So you can know how hard your processor is working and if you're pushing it too hard or not, which could be very useful information. So I'm hopeful in the future we'll see pressure observers ship to all major browsers, and ideally Google wouldn't need to have this level of access for Meet anymore. But the reason they have it now is because knowing this information about your device is essential for making a good video calling experience. And that's why this happened. It still is scary to think Google is exposing things like that just for themselves. And I, as a competitor to Google Meet with Ping, wish I had access to the same things they do without making my users install a Chrome extension. But at the same time, I do feel for Google and for the engineers that dealt with this in the first place, because they wanted to make the best possible video call app inside of their browser, and they tried to follow the rules, and the rules didn't work great for them. So they broke the rules in a way that was initially limited in scope. And then over time, the scope expanded to the point where a tweet like this could go viral. I was terrified when I saw this, as I'm sure a lot of you guys were as well when you saw the opening of the video. You can tell how scared I am from how I opened this. But now that I've dug into this and I spent the last far too many hours trying to figure it out, it's not that big of a deal. But yeah, go use Ladybird, I guess. Peace.